Hello there and good afternoon to this special coverage of Ukraine-Russia conflict. Russia has dismissed speculation that it will declare all-out war in Ukraine in the coming days as nonsense. Moscow has up until now denied it is a war, instead referring to this invasion as a special military operation. But Western officials have speculated that President Vladimir Putin could use the 9th of May victory parade to announce an escalation of military action. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, however, said there was no truth to the rumors at all. UK's Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said last week that Moscow parade commemorating the defeat of the Nazis and the end of the World War II might be used to drum up support for mass mobilization of troops and a new push into Ukraine. Latest reports suggest that after the recent successful evacuation of some civilians, attacks on the steelworks have resumed and contact has been lost with the last remaining soldiers inside. Based on these recent events, the question should be raised: is Russia now really want to relaunch its military operation over all Ukraine, or still Russia may target the Donbas region only? And are Ukraine forces ready for another month of battling operations? To answer these questions, we have Mr. Georgi Katestadze, State and International Security Analyst from Georgia, and Aditi Bahaduri, Editor-in-Chief of International Affairs Review from India. Gentlemen, my lady, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. Before we delve into this debate, until now and in the meantime, there is an international conference over Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it is held over the NATO countries. So, based on this international conference that is being held right now, Mrs. Aditi, what are you saying about this? What is the aim behind this international conference?
Well, I cannot be a professor, but what I do know is that the conflict is being escalated and being exacerbated by the unchecked flow of arms and military aid, which the Western countries are sending to the Ukraine without sending any troops on the ground. And I really don't see where this conflict is heading. I mean, it's the Ukrainians who are suffering most. So I think that before any international conference, we must have a total halt to, all these foreign arms shipments to Ukraine. And then we can the international community can prevail upon the two sides to come back to the negotiating table. Mm-hmm. But right now, I don't see that happening. Definitely not with the arms escalation. I don't think Russia is going to be backing down.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Mr. Georgi, what are you saying about this? What is your comment?
First of all, thank you for having me here in your program. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me. I would like to mention that, first of all, Ukraine needs the weapon and all the necessary needs to defend themselves. As Mr. Peskov mentioned, it's not the right time for negotiations now because Russia did not achieve any political or military aims. It was what was planned before the full-scale invasion. So at least now Ukrainian defenses are pretty strong, better than it was 2 months ago. So unfortunately, people are suffering, civilians, casualties, and it's not the right time to negotiation now because it not decided what will be kind of victory for either side. So let's see what happens before the 9th of May, major military parade in Kremlin. So unfortunately, I cannot see the free room for negotiations now.
Perfectly understood. Now moving on to the second point. Russia said on Thursday that its artillery had targeted multiple Ukrainian positions and strongholds overnight, killing over 600 fighters. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continued the special military operation in the eastern of Ukraine.
The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue their special military operation in Ukraine. High-precision air-based missiles of the Russian aerospace forces destroyed. Artillery units hit 32 command posts, 5 ammunition depots, 403 strongholds, areas where personal and military equipment are concentrated, as well as 51 Ukrainian artillery positions, over 600 nationalists, and 61 units of weapons and military equipment were destroyed.
Mr. Georgi, since you are in Europe, much closer to the current circumstances over there, I will be starting with you. British intelligence service is saying that Russia now is more than ever looking to take all over Ukraine. Russian officials are denying. So, what is the expectations over there? In your opinion, which fact that is close to be true?
We can assume that British intelligence society is stands close to the truth. So personally, I believe in this statement. But any other provocations or statements from the Russian side say they're not true, or they're trying to gain time to regroup their forces and attack again in the southern and the eastern part of Ukraine. But as we see already 2 weeks, Russian second phase of attack already launched, but any major success. On the other hand, we see successful ongoing counter-attacking operations from Ukrainian armed forces. Yesterday and even today it still continues in the region of Kharkiv, north of Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv. Ukrainian armed forces liberated a couple of settlements there, and really important location, Izium. Russian forces tried to capture this place to seize the northern part of the Ukrainian defenses in the east part of Ukraine. But unfortunately for them, they could not succeed. And on the other hand, the Ukrainian armed forces counterattacking successfully.
Quite understood. Mrs. Aditi, your writings as an editor-in-chief goes in English as well as in Russian. You are aware of the Russian strategy based on your experience. What are you saying about this? Is Russia planning to take Ukraine completely, or this is just a British made, taking into consideration that British are called masters of disinformation?
Well, see, I don't think Russia is planning to, take over Ukraine as in its entirety. It's not going to be cost effective. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be a headache for the Russians. What they probably might want to do is that, they might want to take over the parts, the eastern parts, which would give them a land corridor from the Donetsk, the Donbas region, down to the Crimea. So they might be wanting to do that, and this may be their aim. At the same time, they might be wanting to dismantle Ukraine's military infrastructure and have it become a kind of a neutral state, which will not join NATO, which probably was not invited to join NATO and the European Union, but a kind of a sort of a neutral state on the borders of Russia. So that might be a possibility.
Quite understood. All right, moving on to another point. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was on Wednesday, May 4th, reiterated a warning that Russia would seek to destroy convoys of armed shipments to Ukraine from Western countries, which in recent weeks have stepped up these supplies. Russia's defense ministry said earlier that it had disabled 6 railway stations in Ukraine used to supply Ukrainian forces with Western-made weapons in the country's east by bombing their power supplies. It was not possible to independently verify the claim, which did not say which Western-made weapons were supplied to Ukrainian forces via those stations. There were no immediate reaction from Kiev.
The United States and its NATO allies are continuing to pump weapons into Ukraine. I want to mention that we view any transport of a North Atlantic alliance arriving on the territory of the country with weapons or materials destined to Ukrainian army as a legitimate target to be destroyed.
Coming back to you, Mr. Georgi, NATO wants Russia. Russia wants NATO. What that's supposed to mean? Don't you think that if NATO wants this war to end, they must use diplomacy and negotiations, not delivering weapons? Weapons makes the situation even worse. Do you agree with that?
First of all, personally, I strongly believe that the phrase which you mentioned, also the other experts are mentioning that escalate the conflict by delivering the weaponry, it's not correct and stands far away from the truth, because at least now, when the conflict is hot faced, Ukraine needs to defend themselves and defend the sovereignty of the country, because collective West, NATO, European Union, even particularly US, tried almost everything before the full-scale invasion. Asked almost every day Russia to sit down on table of negotiation, but for them, I think Russians already made a wrong decision for full-scale invasion, and to say that now West needs to stop delivering weapons, it's not right. Because we already experienced similar conflicts, maybe in a lower phase, but almost similar conflicts in Georgia, in Prидnestrovia, in Moldavia, in 90s, also other conflict spheres in the post-Soviet era and post-Soviet countries. Unfortunately, at that time, I would like to mention the last Russo-Georgian War in 2008. Hot sphere of conflict continues only 5 days, but unfortunately, we could not see that time reasonable and enough support from collective West, especially from European Union, because that time actually the West gave Russia a pass. So I would like to repeat again.
Sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Georgi.
Yes.
Sorry to cut your train of thought, but don't you think that delivering weapons daily, it is another way of battling Russia? I mean, the Western nations are using Ukraine to fight Russia. Don't you think this? They are sacrificing Ukraine for the sake of their interest.
Actually, we cannot say this, because every country have the right to defend themselves, right? Defend their freedom, their choice. Mm-hmm. They are free to join any military alliance or union they want, and nobody can stand and deny this option, right? So in this case, when Russian Federation, officially the second military power in the world, attacking a neighbor country, the country has the right to defend themselves. That's true. Mm-hmm. We had no enough weapon and aid from the collective West. In 2008, we lost control over 2 territories, and Russia recognized those regions as independent countries. Similar scenario, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to make, exact similarities, because it's kind of still different situation. But Russia has clear plans to somehow regain control, at least in some parts of the post-Soviet countries.
Perfectly understood.
That's true, and that's the reality, yes.
Perfectly understood. Mrs. Aditi, do you agree or disagree with what Mr. Georgi is explaining, saying that NATO is delivering weapons to help Ukraine, not to use Ukraine as a grenade to harm Russia?
You know, even the earlier time I was on your show, I had said that Ukraine has become a proxy, a battlefield for a proxy war between Russia and the NATO countries. And I maintain that. And at the beginning of your show, I did say that if parties are interested in genuinely interested in bringing the two sides to the negotiating table to halt the conflict, then the flow of arms has to be stopped. I mean, we just saw President Biden recently, he again sanctioned billions of dollars of arms shipment. Now, just think, at the end of the day, who does such shipments benefit? It's the arms manufacturers, it's the military industrial complex in the NATO countries, and what is happening in Ukraine. So if they're so interested, okay, they want to defend Ukraine, why don't they send like regular troops, but they're not doing that. There are troops, there are mercenaries. And why are there mercenaries? They may be belonging to regular armies, but so that in case they are caught, the governments can wash their hands off them. The governments can absolve themselves. So what kind of help is that? What kind of help does a friend, render to another friend? That is not any help, really. That is actually, you're making use of, you're making profits out of the war. And it's the poor Ukrainians who are being sacrificed.
Thank you so much for this point. Yeah. Mr. Georgi, Mrs. Adish is saying that what NATO countries are doing, just adding the fuel to the fire. This is not the right way to help Ukraine. Other way, they may go for negotiations and diplomacy as Russia called before. Don't you think that this is the right way?
I don't know how to put this delicately, but simply it's wrong understanding of the conflict, because when we're talking about Russia, we need to go deeper in their psychology, toxicology, and their point of views, right? We know Mr. Shoigu. Shoigu was the chief of Russian military forces in Abkhazia. Abkhazia is the Western Georgia, now recognized by Russia as an independent country. We signed 3 separate ceasefire agreements with, as they called, Russia-backed separatists that time. But every time they used the time to regroup and counterattack again. And fortunately for us, finally we lost control of the territory. Mm-hmm. The same situation now. Of course, Western countries are not going to send troops, regular troops on Ukrainian soil, because it's further escalates the situation and maybe even provoke the nuclear war, right? But of course, they will make sure, after the Lend-Lease, of course, they will make sure that Ukraine will receive any weapon whatsoever important and needy to defend themselves and defend their freedom and sovereignty. Because if Russia is not going to stop here in Ukraine, next targets will be either Baltic states or even Poland. I'm talking about the NATO member countries. Mm-hmm. Because finally, collective West made the decision that Russia crossed all the red lines. But personally, I think that many of my colleagues also internationally will agree on me, that West need to do it even before, when Russian Federation annexed Crimea and provoked the war in the eastern part of the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, many countries and many officials kept quiet and still dealing with Russia and making money. I'm talking about, of course, official trades and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Moving away from this dilemma, which one is helping Ukraine for real? Emmanuel Macron will discuss the war in Ukraine with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is on the tour in Europe, calling for dialogue to end the conflict while avoiding condemning Russia. The Indian Prime Minister must be received at Élysée today for a bilateral meeting followed by a walk-in dinner, said that the presidency, specifying that this was his 3rd visit to France since 2017, while Emmanuel Macron traveled to India in March 2018. Mrs. Aditi, coming back to you, as we can see now, India is being put in the middle. Russia trying to strengthen its relationships with India. USA warns India if intended to aid Russia. British Prime Minister visited India. And now France receives Indian Prime Minister. Why this sudden Indian cooperation by all parties? what role India can deliver?
Well, India is a rising power, and it has very good relations, excellent relations with Russia ever since it gained independence. In the recent past, India's relations with the West, which were traditionally not too warm or close, have also been growing rapidly. The West recognizes India's potential as the world's largest democracy, as a military power, as a naval power, as a manufacturing base, with a huge intelligence pool. So, I mean, you name it, and India has it. And of course, India and EU have been strengthening relations. They have a huge, they're very big trade partners. But at the same time, I mean, it's India, amongst the democracies and countries with good relations with the West, which has also stood by Russia ever since the beginning of the conflict. I mean, India has abstained from every UN resolution, whether in the General Assembly, whether in the Security Council, and it is continuing its trade, it's continuing its defense cooperation with Russia, and I think that India is one of the few countries, though I would say not the only country, which is in a position to prevail on Russia, to talk to Russia. And as the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, said, there will be no winners in this war. War is never an answer. And so I hope that India can, maybe with countries like the UAE, which also has very good relations with both the Western world and with Russia, maybe Israel, which also has strong ties with both sides, though in the recent past, I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov's comments, have been kind of have angered. But I think that there are these countries which are not entirely in the Western camp with good ties to Russia. It's time for them to come together and get a ceasefire at least in place, and then the negotiations.
Quite understood. Mr. Georgi, what are you saying about this? Do you think that India can play a major role to end the war or to push the escalation ever forward between the West and the East? And what is your comment over what has been written in March? Georgia might be the next Russian target.
First of all, it's pretty clear that I agree with my colleague that India is in position, the country which can speak to Russia and also the West. Unfortunately, not the India and only any other country except Russia is not in a position to stop this bloodshed. Other countries also tried to negotiate, open the table for both sides. Even Turkey, which is an emerging power in the region, and particularly interested to de-escalate the situation. Turkey is also the NATO member country, and Turkey, it's not only representing himself and itself, but also the NATO generally. But these negotiations failed because, unfortunately, I see that Russians are not interested in negotiations. They use the negotiations, at least in level to regroup, gain the forces, and try again, because their full-scale invasion, first phase, at least failed. On the long run, they already lost, but it's pretty clear that they still need to achieve at least something to sell it as a propaganda material inside the country. So what's about the next aim of Russia? If, as I mentioned before, if Russia is not going to stop right now in Ukraine, and Russia somehow still gained the power and could became stronger enough to attack, they will do it again for sure.
Perfect. What might put Georgia as a target for Russia, since you are from this country?
Currently, we have a situation that approximately 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. As I told you, as I mentioned before, Russian official position is that two regions of Georgia is now independent countries, as they said regarding the Lugansk and Donetsk regions for Ukraine. And Russian military stands approximately 35 kilometers away from the capital of Georgia.
Okay.
So they do not need any provocation because it's impossible when we are dealing with Russia on a daily basis. No matter what you do, what kind of policy and government apply, either balancing or try to seek help in West or other countries, if Russia decides to somehow de-escalate situation, there is no need any additional purpose for that.
Much appreciated for this.
Any reason, to be clear, any reason can be enough for Russia to further escalate. But on this point, I don't think so that right now at present they have enough sources in the Caucasus region and also in occupied territories of Georgia to further escalate the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Georgi. U.S. President Joe Biden said on Wednesday he would discuss possible additional sanctions against Russia this week with G7 countries.
With regard to the additional sanctions, we're always open to additional sanctions, and I've been in consultation. I'll be speaking with the members of the G7 this week about what we're going to do or not do, number one.
Mrs. Aditi, 3 minutes left for the show, so briefly. Previously, I have talked to Mr. Hussein Askari, who is a member of the Belt and the Road Initiative in Sweden, and he told me that these sanctions imposed on Russia is a suicidal policy because it will destroy not only Russia, but rather the whole continent. Do you agree with that?
Yes, indeed, because we can already see that the ruble has actually strengthened. It's bounced back. And while, yes, sanctions would hurt Russia, no doubt. But, you know, it's mostly sanctions never really work. We have seen sanctions, you know, against Iraq and against, you know, earlier. So they just hurt the common people. They don't really hurt, like, if they want to get at the, you know, the political elites. It's not really work. And the war is just causing a lot of disruption around the globe, you know. There is food shortage there, and it's always the more vulnerable who suffer. So yes, in a sense, it's not just Russia that's going to be affected, and sanctions can be counterproductive. We are seeing that the EU has not stopped purchasing, you know, energy. It's energy needs from Russia. So what does that tell us?
Perfect, perfect. Mr. Georgi, do you think that the sanction imposed so far can stop Russia to reach its main goal from this operation? Briefly, please.
Yes, of course. Personally, I strongly believe that sanctions also, it needs time to become significant burden for Russian Federation. Of course, it will be difficult for other countries too, because economic situation, especially exporting the needy amount of grain to other countries will be difficult because already Russia and Ukraine stopped exporting grain. But there is no any other way also somehow to leverage on Russia to change their minds and stop this bloodshed right now. But I need to mention again that this line is pure propaganda Russian line that sanctions is not going to help, and Russia like almighty and still capable of fighting and delivering and reaching their political and military aims.
Quite understood. Quite understood. Mr. Georgi from Georgian International Security Analyst, Mrs. Aditi, Editor-in-Chief of International Affairs Review from India. Thank you so much for joining us in this debate. I really do appreciate your presence. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage also will be held tomorrow. So for now, have a blessed evening.